it's outside of arts and sciences. I got notes from social worker adjunct.
So can we, is it accurate that?
So we've had a nice discussion about how to use budgets to agitate for the end of austerity, racial austerity. And now you've seen the credits for the PowerPoint that will still be available. But now we're moving into the question of transparency, because as Paul Narkunis mentioned, transparency is an issue, and a lot of the materials that you saw were publicly available. But in fact, to agitate successfully, powerfully, one needs to have access to the information about how money is spent, how decisions are made. And that's basically a question of transparency. For reasons that will become obvious, we're going to be talking a lot about Hunter College. But first, let me introduce all of the panelists. We have with us from Lehman College and chapter chair president, Robert Farrell, who's an associate professor in the library. We have Jen Gaburi, who is interim or acting chapter chair at Hunter College. She's an associate professor, she's a lecturer at Hunter in the Women and Gender Studies program. And we have Shandor John, who's also an associate professor. Shandor, I forgot to recall which department you're in. Will you tell our audience?
I'm an adjunct associate professor in the history department at Hunter.
Of course, I should have remembered that. And we also have with us Diana Kennedy. Diana is a rising junior, and she's a major in the Women and Gender Study department. She has expertise on transparency that exceeds my own. At John Jay, we seem to have reasonably moderately transparent functioning. Most recently, our biggest issue is having meetings that are subject to open meeting law, but somehow aren't noticed in the calendar early enough, don't have the 24-hour advance notice with a link so that interested parties can find out when a meeting is and how to attend. So that's one of the issues of transparency, which is actually subject to law. But we're looking also at transparency as essential for politics and contention, even beyond the issues of law. Robert, would you want to tell us a little something about transparency as it looms at Lehman?
Sure. Lehman, I would say, is on the whole rather transparent with its budget. I would say, as it sounds like at John Jay, there's some work to be done on the open meetings law and making sure that everybody is aware of when they can go and learn about the budget. However, as I think has probably been discussed earlier, and as we'll talk about more, a budget is a political document. And even when you have the numbers out in front for everybody to see, those numbers are meaningless without context, and they're deceptive if they're framed within the wrong context. Just within this present budget crunch, there's been a number of examples where our administration has tried to frame the budget numbers in ways that really ultimately give faculty and staff a sense that the administration's decisions on how money is used is inevitable. It's something that we can't actually have a say in, or can't be changed once the decisions of the administrators have been made. Just to give a little example of that, at the beginning of the crisis, the president of our college tried to frame state investment over the decades as rather robust, using numbers that really reflected more SUNY's budget experiences rather than CUNY's, in order to make the argument that the money that Lehman had on hand, and there is a reserve fund on hand, was as much as could be expected, and that we couldn't really expect the state to do more because they had already done so much for us. And that just wasn't true. Another example was around the use of the CARES Act money. There was a line item in our budget for about $4 million of CARES Act money that was to go towards, as they said, expenses related to COVID. the administration said, you know, we can't use that money by law for payroll. And that was simply not true as well. The state attorney general's filing on behalf of CUNY in the PSC's recent lawsuit made it explicit that, you know, if CUNY wanted to, they could use all of the Institutional CARES Act funds for payroll. They simply are choosing not to, claiming that they're going to use it for students, but really holding it in reserve for whatever purposes they envision as this crisis continues to unfold. And, you know, a third example is the college's KUTRA funds. We have a substantial KUTRA balance, which is monies recouped at the end of a fiscal year that are kind of over collections or budget savings in one sense or another. That money really is not the result of fiscal prudence, as our administration likes to frame it, but as when they're pressed, they will admit it's the result of extreme austerity, typically in the form of keeping positions vacant, and really represents money saved, in quotes, on the backs of workers who are doing 2 or 3 people's jobs simultaneously. So when we're talking about money, when we're looking at budgets, we have to realize that that's a site of struggle, it's a site of interpretation, and we have to fight for that money to be used in the way that we know it should be, and for our administrations to be honest about it.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for bringing us back to the CARES money, because I think you were probably also in the room when we learned about that legislation in the works and how we as a union had been involved in shaping what it would be and how confident we were that CARES was going to help us sustain employment. So it's really quite, it's a shocking departure from what we understood the legislative intent of the CARES Act was. So this leads us directly to questions of how budgets work and how transparency works at Hunter. So I'm going to basically, Jen, you will take the lead from here.
Okay, great. So I was really glad, you know, this, all of the group of us being together really reflects a lot of conversations that have been happening across the year that predate the pandemic, right, in many ways, that are about, you know, increasing our budget literacy, and which has been something that on our campus has been a site of some interest for a while. Right, in terms of like the very limited ways in which even I participate as a college senator, you know, and rep for my department in our college senate, which is the senate that has faculty, staff, and students in it. We have very little budget transparency in that setting. The Senate's budget committee doesn't even quote unquote own documents, which means that there are slides, there are very, very limited slides, and sometimes no slides that are prepared. Like historically, the budget chair will get up, the Senate will get up and present a verbal presentation that basically looks like a kind of like outlook that sounds more like a weather report, except it has less data in it. Even when there are slides, then it's up to us to sort of like capture them with our phones because we do not have the permission to sort of like have that data circulate. And it's very marginal at best in terms of like actually being able to use what's there. And just the same way that Robert was pointing to, the question of the context, right, of that data is always the question, right? If something is or is not in what's called a quote unquote discretionary budget, how do I understand what that means, right? How do I understand like what even the categories mean without far greater budget transparency? And then when we've come to learn and look at some of the documents that are filed by colleges with CUNY, we find that they don't necessarily correspond in many ways. The sort of categories that are posted there and the allocations that are posted there might correspond in terms of the overall dollars, but not necessarily match up in terms of those categories. Like those are some of the things that we, you know, have learned in looking at this. And then of course, in moments of crisis, this becomes all the more pressing, right? While we might talk about governance in a broad sense, like we might talk about how in a day-to-day sense for a long time where we need more, for example, where departments and programs do things like clamor for more faculty or clamor for more full-time faculty or clamor for conversion lines, like the kind I sit on, an adjunct conversion line. Without kind of an overall global picture of the college budget, what we are really left to do on a regular basis, and one of the things I really despise about the ways in which then the college functions, absent a free flow of information is you're trapped to only advocate for yourself in a very narrow silo, and that you're not taught to collaborate. You're not taught to think about joint lines. You're only sort of like there to advocate for yourself as hard as you can, but you also don't have the sort of clear picture in terms of like even being able to do that. And then it really becomes a sort of zero-sum game for you. And also then when you're asked to take a cut or you're negotiating on class caps or class sizes as you are, it's very difficult, right, to do that absent a free flow of information, both to sort of like either argue for something that you want or to say, yes, I agree to take a cut. Because if we knew, like right now when we're having discussions about class caps, if we knew that there was parity across the college and we knew more about budget transparency across the college, it would be a little bit easier to say, okay, I will agree to this. And in fact, but I will agree to this collectively because all of us, right, are agreeing to these class caps. But then in fact, when you poke around, you learn, no, this person has made this deal, this person has made this deal, this person has made this deal. And then you feel, not only do you feel crappy, but you don't feel like there is a kind of shared project that has legitimacy. And that really goes back to kind of the core of what it means for information to not circulate, right? There's a big, you know, I mean, in many of these discussions, right, it sort of is emphasized within the Senate or other people like, well, you faculty or you people are not the decision makers. Well, it's not about being the decision makers, right? It's about being members of the community who do have roles in governance. And then when those decisions are made, that those decisions have legitimacy. And that we have faith and can participate. Like if someone comes to me and says, I would like you to teach this kind of class rather than this kind of class, as someone recently asked me, I'm like, I can make that sacrifice if I know what the context is, if I have more information, right? But absent that, I don't have a lot of information. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happened, a really terrible development that's happened more recently at Hunter that has to do with lack of budget transparency, and then as well as the situation where adjuncts are being treated extremely poorly in terms of pay. It was left up to us as a chapter to discover this on our own, putting pieces together, and then share it with people. Lo and behold, the college, has known about it and decided not to sort of share it with adjuncts, that we are in a situation where we're going to pay people late. And so my colleague Chandra now is going to talk a little bit more about what happened and what's going on with that situation. And we both serve on our chapter's executive committee. Chandra.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that we should probably say that we're actually recording this beforehand. So we haven't heard, well, at least I haven't heard the previous discussion before this segment. But for technical and other reasons, we're doing that. And when I was looking down before, obviously I was looking on my phone and I was trying to find out more information about what Robert referred to, which is some details about the lawsuit. And if he has time later on, if you could talk a little bit more about the Attorney General. So I was looking up that the State Attorney General, Letitia James, was arguing on behalf of obviously CUNY management and some of the arguments that were being made by them. So I thought it was very interesting before when there was a reference to agitation, and I actually I usually don't write down what I'm going to say very much, including in class or talks. But I was imagining actually the sort of agitation that I think we can and should do. But first, I think that right now, in terms of what Jen was referring to, we have a very serious situation at Hunter, which extends beyond Hunter. First of all, at Hunter, the cafeteria workers who are now CUNY employees are out of work. Okay, so we have a situation where, as we see in so many aspects of society, in the midst of the pandemic and the economic crisis, the people on the bottom of the labor system are being thrown onto the scrap heap, and that has everything to do with class and with racial oppression and with the way things are, in the society that we live in. But what Jen was referring to as well is that, we found out that after laying off about a fifth of all CUNY adjuncts, okay, that now CUNY management is wreaking new havoc on large numbers of adjuncts and new damage to people on the bottom of CUNY's, what we call the two-tier labor system in the academic system at CUNY. So while it's sitting on millions of dollars in CARES Act funds, now they are slated, and apparently up to 60%, we're told, of adjuncts at CUNY, at Hunter at least, are slated to be paid late. And when we say late, we're talking about really late. We're talking about apparently 1 to 2 paychecks late. Okay. So, if we're talking about facts, if we're talking about information, did CUNY tell the union this? Did CUNY tell those affected this? Did CUNY tell those targeted this? Did they even tell them, before imposing this kind of penury and deprivation on them in the midst of a pandemic and a looming, evictions crisis? This was going to happen. Well, we all know the answer to that. Did the chancellor tell people? So if you talk about a lack of transparency, it's amazing. And there's more to, I think there's more to say about that. I just wanted to mention that in the midst of that, we remember that 4 years ago, there was even the state's own inspector general launched an investigation of finances at the City University of New York, finding all kinds of, funny business financially, and what even they called that CUNY has expended funds on questionable activities. We want to talk about questionable, not telling people that they're going to be paid, many weeks late, let alone doing that to people. So I also just wanted to say a few things agitation-wise, if that's okay with people. So we're talking about transparency, and I think that one of the things that we should point out is what is transparent and what is not. So of course, CUNY management doesn't want the budget to be transparent, but there's some things that I think we can and should say are transparently obvious. So, first of all, again, that the people on the bottom of the labor system and the bottom of the social system are being ground down, and that our students at CUNY are very largely daughters and sons of essential workers who make the city run. African-American, Latino, immigrant, Asian, and other working class, students, rather workers who are deemed essential but disposable. And the cuts that are going on target those students and their families. And the deliberate starvation of resources to CUNY targets our students. The layoffs of adjuncts targets our students, and they target all of us who work at CUNY. And last, along the lines of this question of agitation, I think that the main point is that the claims that there's no money is nonsense. This is the center of finance capital in the world. And the ruling class and its politicians go by the axiom to never let a good crisis go to waste. Okay, and in the midst of this crisis, needless to say, they continue to enrich themselves obscenely and to drive and grind down the working class and oppressed communities even further. And we're not about to tolerate that, because it's here at CUNY that race and class and public education, and throughout actually public education, converge. There's an old militant labor demand, and that is to open the books. We need to demand of the CUNY administration, open the accounting books, open your ledgers, open the financial records, open the books, open them to faculty, staff, and students now. We should form committees to inspect those financial records. It's not abstract. And like we're saying, that adjuncts have been blindsided by the fact that many are now going to be, how the hell are they going to pay their rent? Is CUNY going to pay their rent? Well, we know that CUNY does pay some people's rent, right? On top of $750,000 for the chancellor, right? He gets $7,500 per month for rent. So they pay his rent.
That's a great place to end up, Shandor, because we have such little time, and we do want to hear from Diana.
Got it. So I'll end up. So I think we should ask those sorts of questions. I'm sorry, I went over. I wasn't looking at the time, but I think we need to demand that CUNY pay adjuncts and pay them on time. Open the books. We want to see where the money is and where it's going. Tell us how many adjuncts are slated throughout CUNY to receive their paychecks late and how late. Okay, stop and reverse all layoffs and cuts. And students and faculty need to get all courses up on Blackboard and CUNY First now.
Thank you. Excellent points.
We need to, I'm sorry,
I'm sorry, Shandor. I should acknowledge that we've got the addition of more students. I hope this is something that we also experienced during the live airing of this 24-hour show. We've been joined by Student Council President and Vice President from John Jay, and Amber Rivero and Andrew Brzezinski, and Amber has extended another invitation. But so that means we're all ears, Diana, to hear from the students' perspective how you've experienced transparency.
Right. So earlier in the summer, I worked with students and faculty to form a letter and a set of demands that focus on uplifting BIPOC students, faculty, and staff at Hunter and at CUNY more broadly. And what I found was that it was very hard to ask for the reallocation of certain funds to support things if I didn't even know where the money was going, which is why the ask for budget transparency is so significant. So one of the large items in my letter is to ask for more transparency on public safety's budget, which I understand from the year 2019 was over $6 million. But I'm not really sure where all the money is going. I know a majority is going to salaries, so I'm not asking to reallocate funds away from salaries, but perhaps another item in the budget, if it's somehow illuminated with transparency, I could target that. So we could say, we also want to expand mental health services at Hunter and to diversify mental health staff. Another issue that I came across was the lack of transparency around buying from CoreCraft, which is a prison labor manufacturer, which all of CUNY and SUNY buys from. And so this lack of transparency around the products and the money that we spend at CoreCraft is really, it's terrible, because how can we say we want to boycott these products, we want to get rid of them, if we don't even know how much money we're spending and how much we're buying from these manufacturers? So yeah, it's incredibly necessary to open the books, as Professor Shandor said. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak.
I think we're all curious how it felt to you to try to pursue that information. Was it a surprise for you that it was as hard as it was?
It was incredibly surprising that this information wasn't readily available, like through a Google search. Considering that CUNY is a public university and this is public money, and so it should be open for everyone to investigate. But yeah, it was very frustrating.
The first time that I had an experience talking about students and transparency, or students and budget money, it was with Andrew Brzezinski, who's with us. And so Andrew, I think we really don't have much time, but is it your experience that student funds are sought to pay for things that in a more transparent world probably would be an obligation of the college to pay?
Yeah, definitely. Things like MetroCards, things like feminine hygiene products, various things that should be provided by by CUNY, that should be provided in the budget, that are basic necessities for student involvement, engagement, feeling, and having a sense of feeling on campus, having a sense of investment into on campus isn't really being provided, and it's kind of right now the onus, it's been made to be the onus on student councils and student activity fees to compensate something that should very well be in the budget, that are kind of like essential things for students and staff and faculty, generally things that are very good for the college's body.
Thank you, Andrew. I would just like to have Amber and Melissa say hi so that we get you on the screen for an instant, but I'm going to turn it over to Jen to wrap up. I think we really don't have much time left. So Amber and Melissa, just go ahead and just tell us.
Hi, I'm well. Thank you for inviting me, and sorry I couldn't come earlier. I just saw the email invite, Professor Hovey. But really quickly before you move on, I also want to just say that I work with the student government president that just got elected to Hunter, and a lot of his conversation with me was around like a lack of transparency, why he has never even had the opportunity to speak to Jennifer Raab, not once since he's been, you know, president, and he keeps feeling like there's a gatekeeper type of, you know, situation going on to even allow him that access to have conversations with her around things that are happening with the budget or for student decisions or fall reopening. And he was asking me for advice on how to navigate that, but he also was asking me for advice about funds, because I guess they were asking him to use student activity fee surplus to fund student emergency funds. And I told him, worst come to worst, go for it. But first you need to press your administration about why they don't have private fundraising and why like they don't have private funds to take care of that emergency fund, and why they're asking student activity fee to go right back into an emergency fund. Where is the private fundraising? Why is your president not doing more?
And we do have private fundraising, but in fact, we have some of the most private fundraising within CUNY. But in fact, what he is pointing to is not just a circumstance in terms of like the use of student funds that is limited to the crisis. It's not limited to crisis times. This is actually a very old practice, not just at Hunter, but on some other campuses about if all students wanted to, for example, look into how their tech fee is used versus the original language of what got your tech fee on your like bill, you would be horrified because it was really meant to be for a very narrow set of purposes, and the colleges have appropriated it. That's a great example, right? When I tell people that at the grad center, for a long time, we had free printing because we still have control of our tech fee, and that's why. And people are shocked to learn that. Free printing, everybody, free printing. Okay. Melissa, I think you might be here for a subsequent meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, I am here for the phone banking session.
We get some spillover.
I can speak.
So just hang out.
Well,
it's a great cause. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah.
So that probably means we have reached about our time. I know that Professor Farrell has to leave us soon. But we've had a nice opportunity to review the range of experiences with transparency at John Jay, Lehman, and Hunter. And I suppose the benefit of having a half an hour for John Jay an hour program in this 24-hour teach-in programming and putting us together is that we get to hear about the issues that matter most at these schools. So thank you all, and enjoy the semester. It's gonna be a great one, right?
Thank
I'm
you.
really glad we could have this conversation.
Yes, fantastic.
Me too. Thank you.